Hi everybody, welcome back to the Flicks the Church Forgot. I'm Peter Laws. Tonight I'm going to be taking a quick look at a great new release from Arrow Video called The American Horror Project. Stephen Thrower is an author and journalist, but his job title should probably be horror archaeologist, because digging up precious relics is pretty much what he does. He's like a goatee Dr. Jones blowing dust off ultra-rare forgotten films, and one of the finest examples of him doing this was in his mighty coffee table book called The American Nightmare, The Untold Story of the Exploitation Independence, which I've got here and is massive and fantastic. And this month he brings 3 quirky artifacts into the light, a trio of 1970s flicks that are so cult that some fans have not even heard the titles, never mind seen the films themselves. Maletesta's Carnival of Blood from 1973 is probably the least known of the films. I've read some critics who said they had no idea what it was, never mind seen it. I, on the other hand, got really chuffed with myself thinking that I had not only seen it, but that I had a big box VHS copy of it when I was a teenager, which I bought from a market stall in the northeast of England. However, pride cometh before a fall, because it turns out Carnival of Blood that I had was a ropey horror movie starring Burt Young from Rocky and Back to School. This Carnival of Blood is a lot more interesting, and yes, it means I'd never actually heard of it in the end. Anyway, in the film, a family take jobs at a fairground hoping they might find their missing son, and instead they meet a horde of carnival ghouls who devour living flesh in the vaults of the fair. And some of these ghouls are great. The commentary makes a good point that this film follows a sort of James Bond style dual villain system, in that you have one main evil one called Maletesta. He's a very suave guy, and then you get this other bald guy who's the secondary baddie, and we actually see much more of him than Maletesta. But what I like about these sorts of films is that sometimes you spot a third inconsequential baddie that actually ends up sticking in the memory. And in this, there is this crazy looking janitor guy with wild unkempt hair who pushes around a broom a lot. But when you see him creeping up into the background shots out of the shadows, it is really quite freaky. Now, the film is incredibly schlocky, yes, and the budget is cheap as ye olde chips, but none of this stops it from being a sumptuous left-field nightmare. On paper, it looks like comedy, a parody even. There's a moment, for example, where a trio of zombie hippie monsters sing a 3-part harmony. There's a bunch of moments where you see these undead weirdos dragging their victims into these lavish cotton candy style dungeons. You have never ever seen so much pink fiberglass in a horror film. Yet despite these absurd sounding ideas, I think the dread really remains in this. There's moments, particularly in the first half, which I just thought were really tense and unsettling. Now, I'm too young, or slightly too young, to have really appreciated the 70s at the time, but I am still a sucker for 70s styling anyway, more so than 80s styling. So this film had me lingering shots of fat families struggling to get into bobbing tunnel love boats. You know, the type of family you see blowing up rubber dinghies at the beach on Steven Spielberg's Jaws. Well, there's a family like that in this, and it's just great. But anyway, I loved all of the gazing on real-life carnivals that were used by real-life people, but just happened to be co-opted by this crazy bunch of filmmakers at the time. So I love that. It's got a lovely down and dirty aesthetic. But when the night falls and the swivel-eyed ghouls start crawling out of the shadows, it's a surprisingly tense and inventive film. I really do think it's worth checking out. Now, the gears really shift for The Witch Who Came from the Sea from 1976, which plays like Roman Polanski's Repulsion grafted into seaside America. Now, bear in mind that I think Repulsion is one of the scariest films that I've seen personally. Then you'll understand why The Witch Who Came from the Sea really did get under my skin. Molly Perkins plays the kindly aunt whose mind we get to see crack apart in the film, and it's a subversive, disturbing story that stayed with me for days. It still has stayed with me now, even as I think about it. Put it this way, there are images from this film I would like to unsee. And that's not a criticism, by the way, and I'm not even referring to the gore or the violence. It's just that I think horror is often at its most potent when it shines a light on the complex terrors of domestic life, and that's what this film does. And what I loved about the film, it's its refusal to be simple. So many films, and to be frank, audiences want films to be very clear on who's the goodies and who are the baddies. I think that's why superhero films are so popular these days, because they are such a sort of pure version of good against evil. Yes, I know, if you're a superhero fan, there's nuances on both sides of the baddies and the goodies, but the hard line, the line between hero and villain is pretty clear. In these films, however, the director seems to refuse to paint the characters as either good or bad. The witch even seems to excuse the one who hurt her in the past, which seems inexplicable at first, confusing even, and yet here I was as an audience member doing the exact same thing in my sympathy towards her and her terrible acts. I just think there's a very powerful lesson about so-called human evil in this film, namely that morality can be very, very complicated, and sometimes slotting someone into good or evil, into the files as it were, it doesn't cut it in a world of complex psychology. So The Witch Who Came from the Sea, I think, is an acquired taste. I think it'll leave some viewers cold, especially if they've seen the amazing poster, which does promise a schlocky sort of Conan the Barbarian style horror movie. This is a world away from that. It's a much more dark, personal drama, but the script is excellent, the acting unsettling, and I thought the subject matter was incredibly grown up and really quite uncompromising. I think it was a very good film. Finally, we get to a film called The Premonition from 1976, a supernatural thriller with the sort of one-line, poster-ready premise that studio executives adore. What if the parent of your adopted daughter turned up wanting her back? You can imagine that on the front of a book. It could have been just a tense family drama, but it turns all spooky when the adoptive mother starts having these strange visions. Is she going mad, or is she getting genuine psychic insights into the lives of others? Now, people used to horror will be thinking this sounds a bit reminiscent, perhaps, of another big-budget horror called Audrey Rose with Anthony Hopkins. That had a similar idea of family drama and supernatural, where some parents meet a man who insists that their daughter is the reincarnation of his daughter who was lost in a horrendous accident. You know, thinking about it in remake terms, I really think at some point in the future Hollywood is going to stumble back on Audrey Rose and make a new version of it, just because that hook idea is pretty good for posters and trailers. I think it would probably get people to come and see it. But anyway, The Premonition takes a similar vibe, but it's got a very different feel from Audrey Rose. I'd say that this film is the weakest of the three on the American Horror Project, in that it's a slow starter. But however, having said that, halfway through I suddenly noticed I was really quite gripped. ESP, family breakdown, it's a literal time capsule of 1970s concerns. Now remember, this was the decade that everybody got obsessed with Uri Geller and the unexplained, so this is a film very much of its time. But thinking about it, I would say when you look at the American Horror Project as a whole, all three of these films are windows into a specific decade. And also in their pacing and style, so much so that modern audiences might not have any idea what the appeal of these films are, because they really don't make films like this anymore in some ways, which I think is all the more reason to celebrate the folks who dig these grisly treasures up. I really can't wait for Volume 2. Well, look, everybody, that's it for this episode. For more episodes, including my in-depth look at all sorts of different horror movies and exploring the spiritual, deeper themes there, you can check out my website, theflicksthechurchforgot.com. Please don't forget to share and subscribe, or follow me on Twitter at Rev Peter Laws, or on Facebook at The Flicks the Church Forgot. Join me in the next episode, where I'm going to be looking at Goodnight Mommy, Deathgasm, The Monolith Monsters, Monster on the Campus, and Budo, The Art of Killing. How's that for a quaint bunch of titles? But until then, don't forget, The Flicks the Church Forgot.